Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Shannon, and this event is hosted in partnership with my fellow UW Honors students, as well as Real Change News and the House Our Neighbors Coalition. And we're really excited to have you all here to join our conversation today about social housing. Just a reminder for my peers, we'd like to stay after class for a few minutes, so just hang out in the back afterwards when you're done. And I'll hand it over to our moderators now.
Thank you, Shannon. So thank you again, everyone, for showing up today. I'm Jacob.
I'm Angelique.
We're students in a class called Abolishing Poverty, Shelter, Mutual Aid and Care. And this class focuses on reframing the discourse on impoverishment, the causes that contribute to houselessness, and the advocacy work that's being done to address it. So today we are working in collaboration with our wonderful professor, Dr. Vicki Lawson, Real Change News, as well as our amazing panelists, to welcome you to our culminating event, which is called Social Housing, Halting the Pipeline into Houselessness. Tonight, we have brought together panelists from a range of backgrounds to discuss with you, the UW community, social housing, basically, and how it can be implemented in Seattle. So we're very excited to kick this off, and we look forward to learning together.
So for any folks joining on Zoom, we ask that you keep yourself muted. Any questions you have, please type them in the chat. There will be a Q&A period. Before getting started into our conversation, we would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Coast Salish people, past and present, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. In particular, we would like to acknowledge the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people who are currently still seeking federal recognition for the Duwamish tribe, and whom you can support by visiting their website and paying rent at Real Rent Duwamish. It is especially relevant to acknowledge the history of land use and distribution in this region and how it's been influenced by inequality and racism. Moving forward, as we discuss new approaches to how we view land, it is necessary that we include this history and how it impacts us today.
Yeah, so before we get into it, we're going to hand it off to Camille G from Real Change News. She's going to speak to what her organization does and what they are planning on telling us today about their new initiatives.
Thank you everyone for being here. And a really, really huge thank you to the students in this class who have done a really, really excellent job at putting together such an amazing event that we're all super excited for. So as I mentioned, I'm Camille. I am a member of the advocacy team at Real Change. Most people who have been in Seattle for a while know Real Change as a street newspaper that you can find being sold by local vendors. But on top of that, Real Change is also an organization dedicated to creating employment opportunities for unhoused and low-income people, as well as leading on advocacy initiatives focused around housing and homelessness. And one of those initiatives that we work on as an advocacy team is supporting our political coalition, which is called House Our Neighbors. House Our Neighbors is a coalition of folks who have lived experience with homelessness, are housing activists, mutual aid providers, and just people involved in housing in general. And House Our Neighbors, as an organization, as a coalition, we know that there's no more time to wait as to solve the issues of homelessness and housing. And so that is why, as a coalition, we've started working on a ballot initiative that would create and build and acquire social housing in the city of Seattle. So we're really hoping that this panel today will start to highlight some of the reasons why we need social housing, what social housing is, and how we can bring it here to Seattle. If you are feeling inspired after today's panel, there are sign-up sheets to be a part of our campaign on the table on the way out. For folks who are on Zoom, we're going to put in the chat our website, which is houseourneighbors.org, as well as our Twitter at @house_neighbors. And additionally, we are having educational tables happening around the city on different days. Tomorrow, my colleague Jacob will be at the Capitol Hill Light Rail Station on Broadway and John talking to folks about what social housing is, as well as at the U District Farmers Market on Saturday from 10 to 12. So thank you all so much again for being here, and we are really looking forward to learning alongside you.
Thank you, Camille. We will now introduce our panelists. So first we have Zachary Wood. Zachary Wood is an assistant professor in the Institute of Public Service at Seattle University and an expert with international experience studying social housing. Thank you for being with us.
We would also like to welcome Carl Nakajima. He is from Real Change Advocacy and also a street vendor for Real Change News. You can find him postering for House Our Neighbors and Democracy Now! Throughout the city. And he has a lived experience with houselessness, so he's going to be a great voice on the panel today.
We next have Linda Hurley Isham. She is a senior lecturer in the College of Urban Studies at UW-Tacoma with research experience on strategies for improving community wellness.
And lastly, we have Kate Rubin, the Executive Director of Be Seattle. So she's in charge of tenant advocacy and education throughout Seattle.
So thank you so much for joining us and offering your expertise.
Yeah, so without further ado, we're going to get straight into the questions, right into the meat of it. And the first question we have is for Zach. And it's more of a general question. I think a lot of people here are wondering this. What is social housing? How does it differ from public housing and other forms of affordable housing?
Right, it's a super important question. It's sort of a pet peeve of mine. Things like social housing, here I am. Yeah, so we conflate these terms a lot. And I think it's really important specifically for us to parse out exactly what we mean when we talk about something like social housing. So globally, we can oftentimes use social housing, public housing, workforce housing interchangeably, right? But it's very dangerous to do that in the United States, particularly because we have a context in the United States for what public housing is. And sometimes we will try to conflate then social housing with public housing. And we see that actually a lot in the media. We see that with public officials as well, who should know better. And so we have to make sure that we're very clear about what we mean by social housing. Public housing in the United States has a long and troubled, challenged history, right? We did lots of things as we developed public housing units and then did lots of things wrong. For the most part, we created public housing in its outset to actually be the kind of social housing that we want to talk about today, but we changed the structure of how we did that, right? So initially public housing was for folks who were working, right? And that they were paying portions of their dollars into the system overall, which helped to maintain public housing facilities and buildings. Over time, we realized, largely through advocacy, that we wanted to change who we were serving through that to not just serve folks who are working but also then serve the people whose need was the highest, right? And so we changed our structure in terms of who we were serving through these systems, but we didn't change the structures themselves, right? So what we ended up with was it was serving oftentimes the people with the least amount of ability to pay and least amount of income, which is a great strategy, but that means no money now coming into the system. And we never really budgeted money towards the idea of maintaining buildings. The reason I say this is that's the sort of context now that most people know and understand about public housing. And when they talk about public housing, they say, boy, that was a mitigated disaster, right? Like don't go anywhere near public housing. And they largely now, as a result of all this, blame either bad governance or they blame poor people, right? They don't actually blame the systems that created those kinds of disparities to begin with and created the challenges that public housing systems had overall. So now we're trying to strike back to the idea of what a social housing system might be, right? And there's a couple of key facets that comes out of the social housing concept. First and foremost, that it's publicly owned, right? Now that might look the same thing as public housing. These are government-run, government-owned facilities, but there's something distinctly different in the ways that we're doing this. Public housing now is essentially a private market structure and a private market run system. So we now provide public housing largely through housing vouchers, right? Which then get taken out onto the private market, right? Or we rely on ensuring that developers then are the ones that are building public housing units for us, which that means that essentially in that kind of development of affordable housing, most of the actual proceeds, benefits, and wealth creation is actually going to private developers who already have loads of private wealth to begin with, right? So we use these different mechanisms now for us to be able to achieve affordable housing, and most of that is leveraging the private market, and most of that wealth is actually going then and remaining in the private market. Social housing is going to be a different approach, right? Social housing is designed to be publicly owned and controlled. The concept here is actually just taking housing off of the private market altogether, right? So instead of leaning into the private market development of housing, we actually have to pull things off. The market, particularly in cities like Seattle, is going haywire, right? So everything becomes much more expensive. And in that kind of calculation all the time, especially with developers have to make a profit in every time that they develop housing. So what we get in return are smaller and smaller and smaller percentages then of what we would deem affordable housing units. That's not good, right? The only way for us to combat a fully privatized market in this kind of way is to pull housing and pull land off of the private market. That way it's government owned, government regulated, but also publicly owned, right? That's us, that's our land, right? And instead of going to the idea of selling private land off to developers in return for small amounts of affordable housing, now we actually retain this land and housing in the public hands. That's our money, that's our land, and we get to then collectively determine how to ensure affordability in perpetuity. And that's the other facet that's really important for us to understand about social housing. Holding it out of the private market means that we then get to retain the control of affordable housing in perpetuity, right? It's permanent. Most of these other developments are affordable housing for 20 years, 30 years. Sometimes you might get somebody to agree to 50 years. But for the most part, there is a ticking clock on what our affordability is. Holding land out of the private market allows for us to retain that permanent affordability.
Thank you for getting us started. That's a great foundation to start. Our next question is for Carl. The question is, from your experience, what would you want to see in housing? What is most needed to support people with unstable shelter?
I guess I talk from my experience. When I first tried to move up from the street, I put myself in a inpatient treatment center. So then after that, I went to the outpatient and they put me in a halfway house. It's just room and I share a kitchen and everything. And then after that time my memories is kind of all messed up. I'm not sure, but during that time, I guess I found a job. And so now it's on my own, but that was middle of the 90, and in that time, in the city of Seattle, they still have a SRO, a single room occupancy type. Like you get very tiny room, like a 6x9 or something, and you share a toilet and shower with other people. And even the hotel, it's style like that, and lots of them in like Chinatown that time. And it is run as a hotel, so everybody just came up with the money, just check in. They're not gonna check your background or anything, and even sometimes no ID. Sometimes they waive, and so pretty much everybody can move in, and there are lots of crazy people. I mean, lots of people. The reason they're in Seattle because they have a warrant in their own state. So and now probably doesn't matter, but that time still you get chance in other states. So anyway, so and some people just doing a barbecue in a room or try to test a homemade bomb in a bathroom or shoot in a hallway, just not hallway, the stairway. It's once in a while it's some that kind of thing happen, but when you run, so if you run out the money, you have to move out. But once you come up the money again, you can move back in again. So it's very, for the people who has a very bad background or not like a apartment that you need a first and last or big chunk of money in the front. So and if paid at night, it's like a $30 or something. I think kind of expensive. But if you pay a week, it's like $10 a day, I believe. I don't remember, but it's like a. But if you pay by the month, I think I pay like a $200 per month. So sometimes like a few days of the day job, you can get earn the money. So for stay 1 month. So I think it's right now. I don't think we have those kind of between a shelter to the apartment, like a how to say transitional, it's just kind of place. So we should have something like that, and I know no private owner want to take a risk for the people who have arson or some background. So it's have to be public or government that if they have to go somewhere. I think everybody have a right to exist, and everybody have a right to house, I believe. And so what I try to say. And even housing is just that building is like we share a toilet and shower, is no problem. Some just they have one small microwave in the lobby, and some people just cook in there, and they don't have any cooking thing in their room. We have a running sink in every room, but and what I try to say, and so the design of the housing itself, I think is, right now just people like buying those, I say like a box, like a core apartment or condo or house, the kitchen, shower, and the toilet, everything in the thing, and it just pretty much shut out from the outside world. But maybe you need to rethink the design also, and that way you can cut the cost of the building. Nobody need a toilet all the time except you have diarrhea or something. So So, and yeah, and just it's yes, and also, what I tried to say, I'm sorry. I get panic and more panic. So, um, um,
What design changes do you think would be best to make it a more livable experience? Do you think there's anything that stood out to you that would be a much better situation if you were to move into social housing?
no, I mean, we need lots of housing now because I don't think they have enough shelter for cover all the homeless people, or even you know. So it just even a prefabric building or something, it's fine. I know this city like to spend money on a building. If you go to Seattle, city of Seattle, you see the city hall, courthouse, police, fire station, especially library. All the library branches, they make it a very fancy building, and they should buy the book or serve the longer hour, I think. But anyway, they, I know, just no, it doesn't matter how it's look, and people without the place to live and the size of the houses doesn't really matter. They just want a security and a few other things, and so maybe even then I hear the excuse of the Seattle, you know geographically we can expand or impossible or something, but in that case really more packed somehow, make it small space, but somehow provide more number of the housing for the people. And I mean, you have to be safe, like fire hazard and stuff, but I think you can create more cheaper and or more place to share, or I don't
Yeah.
know. Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you. From that, I'm guessing, or what I'm getting from that is that you feel we need to have, first of all, just a lot more dedicated space for people to actually be inside, and then to make sure that it's secure and safe and everyone has their own individual space. So I feel like that's a very valuable experience. And so thank you for sharing that. We're going to move on to a question we have for Linda. Thank you. So Linda, could you give us a brief overview of the history behind the displacement of Black and Brown communities in Seattle and how it continues today? I know that's a big question, but a little bit of a summary, I suppose.
Okay. So it's not a recent phenomenon. It has been happening for a long time. Now, if you look for Black and Brown people across the city, it's a test to find them. So when we talk about trying to fix things, it's like you'd have to go back in history and stop some of the practices. So the biggest piece that is contemporary is sort of what I call the urban renaissance that started happening in the 80s and 90s, where I think it was a lot of people from like Gen X were really interested in moving into the city. It's an urban renaissance. I mean, so gas prices had gone high, like today, right? Gas prices had gone high. We were thinking about conservation, and so living in the city, cities were coming back from all of the urban decline. And so people were wanting to live in the city, to be around other people, to have close proximity to the arts and things like that. So that put pressure because you had people who've grown up in the suburbs wanting to move into the city and renew it, right? People were willing to live next to Black and brown people who occupied many of these inner ring community spaces. So they were willing, they were urban pioneers, but it really pushed the pressure up on the cost of living in the city. So people who maybe bought their houses for $20,000, $30,000 were now and had owned their homes, but their rent, the taxes were costing more than what their payments had been, and the houses had been in some degree of decline. And you have this pressure from people wanting to move into the city. And so, many of like the people that I interviewed when I was doing my dissertation said to me, we just wanted to cash out. I mean, here was an opportunity where, I can't renovate my house to bring it to the standards that I would like. My kids don't want to live in it. And so people were looking to cash out. So they sold their houses, and then they found, oh, I thought I could move to Renton or Burien or Federal Way or down to Tacoma, God forbid. And then they found that they couldn't, that really it didn't provide that kind of revenue. So the pressures are real. I mean, so we can talk about things like covenants, the restrictive covenants and things like that. But those were, that's historical. I think what we're seeing today is mostly the result of some of those policies and practices from the 80s and 90s. So it would be more of a matter of creating a range of housing prices and styles so that people across the economic spectrum and the race and ethnicity spectrum are welcome and can afford to be in the city. You can't fix the errors of the past. It's nice to sort of be aware of how those things fell out and why, looking across the city, you don't see a lot of Black and brown people, but to bring more people in, we've got to fill in that missing middle of housing, the range of housing. And okay. I'm gonna get.
Before we continue, we're having some issues with these mics, and they're kind of weak for people who are online. So I would just ask the panelists to, shout and keep it pretty close to your mouth, because it's apparently it's pretty weak. So I appreciate you helping out with that. Thank you.
And thank you, Linda, for sharing your expertise with us. And I think you're highlighting a very, very important point, that we cannot be having separate conversations when it comes to housing and houselessness and race. So I just wanted to say that, and thank you. So our next question is for Kate. How does your work on the ground contribute to the larger goals of building collective power, fighting displacement, and increasing access to affordable housing?
So it's extremely hard to be a renter in Seattle right now, as I'm sure probably most of you know. Even before the pandemic, 46% of us were rent burdened, meaning that we spent more than 30% of our income on our housing alone. The recent numbers, to live in Seattle comfortably and afford a median apartment, you need to earn $115,000 a year if you want to live on your own. Or if you would like to buy, you need to earn $144,000 a year. So even though we have like allegedly affordable housing, none of it covers, none of it is priced in a way that is actually affordable for most people, especially like lower and middle incomes. To afford affordable housing, you have to be paying more than 30% of your income in. And if you receive too much money, you're kicked out of the voucher program, but you definitely can't afford to live anywhere else in the city. So it's just this ongoing problem that is getting worse and worse. And so organizing is so important, because building owners, landlords, they take advantage of our desperation. They keep their units in substandard conditions. They know that we can't afford to move anywhere else, so they let infestations go and they don't make repairs. And alone, we don't have a lot of power. We can report them to SDCI and maybe something will happen. They'll probably get a little like, no, no, no. But that's about it. SDCI doesn't have a lot of power and they don't really, it's not like a huge punishment if you get caught doing something illegal, and it's based on this like complaint system anyway. So the way to accomplish change for tenants is to work together with their neighbors. You have to, you know, if you and you are all living in this building and you all are experiencing the same problems, you're so much louder and you draw so much more attention speaking together than trying to get things accomplished on your own. And the other thing that's important to note is that landowners, wealthy people, they take the time to organize too. If you go to a city council meeting or if you call in, like you hear them, they call in and complain that right now they're trying to get Wallingford to be the entire neighborhood designated a historical district, which means that you couldn't build, you know, apartments and duplexes in there. They think that it's historic because their houses are old, but they're all like old craftsmen from like Sears catalogs. They're not that special. And meanwhile, we have nowhere to live. So you have to pay attention to what's happening in your neighborhood and speak up when you see a problem, and build with your neighbors. There were some tenants down Rainier Court who all received rent increases in that like brief time period before the 180 days came in, and they're low income and they're seniors. So their income's not going up, and they organized together to fight against it. Brought in the media, brought in council members, wrote a petition, shamed their landlord. There's so many techniques that you can do to accomplish your goals, but you have to work together. And if you're the only one in your building, you still can connect to other organizers throughout the city to help grow power. There's so many different ways to contact people who make laws, figure out who owns your building and what other buildings they own. If your neighbors don't want to organize, you can organize with the people in the building over there. Like there's so much that you can do, but you have to just take the time to get involved, because otherwise they're going to keep pushing us out further and further and further out of the city. And of course, Black and brown communities, first to be evicted, experience higher rates of homelessness, but it affects all of us, no matter what your race is. Like you have to protect your neighbors, and you have to, if you start from the top, which is what we've been doing, it's everyone's suffering down worse and worse. But if you start at the bottom and work your way up to helping people, that makes sure that everyone gets protected. And that's the thing that social housing does. Starts and just protects everyone. We all want to live in social housing because it's a home and it's a place where you're happy.
Thank you for sharing all of your advocacy work. And that's a great way to think about it, is like working up, and then that can really make sure that everyone gets involved and everyone's accounted for. And we'd actually like to pass it back to Zach next. We want to know about the lessons that Seattle can take from social housing implemented in the rest of the world. So our question for you is, what would a social housing program look like in Seattle in comparison to other places in the world, and what's being done already?
Yeah, so as we talked about a little bit before, there are some claims that float out there that we are indeed already doing social housing in places like Seattle in the United States. And I want to push back on that quite a bit and say, we're actually not really doing social housing in that kind of way. We are doing little bits of affordable housing, right? And we tend to do that by leveraging the private market, as I said. And so we give developers free public land, and we give developers all kinds of tax credits so that they will develop lots and lots of housing. And in return, we want 10 to 20% of that housing perhaps to be quote unquote affordable, which is also spread out on a large spectrum, which tends to favor higher incomes even within the affordability, right? So we're working against the grain on a lot of these issues. And I think that's really important for us to, as to why we need to dig in specifically on like what those numbers look like and what's actually happening, right? So I would example of what this looks like specifically in Seattle, a great example. So you know the area adjacent to Chinatown International District, Yesler Terrace, right? So Yesler Terrace is the first racially integrated public housing project in the entire United States, okay? It's quite old, right? And so it went into significant disrepair, but actually stayed amazingly communal and wonderfully supportive for folks for a very long period of time. In fact, much longer than most public housing projects had done. It was quite successful in a lot of ways, but it was old and it was getting into disrepair, right? And so they went and said, this is deemed sort of too damaged and we need to renew what's going on in this particular area, right? So it's ripe for redevelopment, and partly because it's also prime land, it's publicly owned land, and it's basically adjacent to downtown, right? And if you know the reason why it's Yesler Terrace, it's on the hill, right? And it was built sort of on these terraces that overlook the sound. It's a gorgeous sort of place, right? Prime real estate in many kinds of ways. So we said we need to leverage all of these advantages that we have. And basically what we did was we sold almost the entire 30-acre plot that was all public housing. And in return, we get this mix of mixed income, right? So mixed income housing is supposed to be this new beautiful way where we are desegregating populations and we're creating all these new opportunities where we can have all different income spectrums along the way. I'm gonna give you a couple of numbers of what that looks like in Yesler Terrace now. There's about 4,000 units that are now on here. It used to be 561. In fact, it used to be more like 680 something, I think, until I-5 demolished a portion of those public housing units. 4,000 units are there. The expectations now are that 2,300 of those new units will be market rate units. That's 58%. 828 of those total units are going to be at what we call the 80% AMI, right? So this is based on that $115,000 a year calculation for a family of 4, right? So if you put folks that are falling within that into that 80% AMI rate is another 21%. What's left is 7% for folks that the 60% AMI, and then 14% are the direct replacements of what was there before, right? So quick math for you on that one. If we calculate the market rate and the 80%, right, put them into a bucket, those go into one building, by the way. We never actually build buildings where we combine people at the low income rate and people at the market rate, right? They're separate but equal, right? We love that terminology. What we end up with here is about 80% of all of the new units being built on this land, public land, 30 acres of public land. Now we have 80% of those units are at the 80% AMI and above, right? 80% of AMI, just for clarification, is about $92,000, right? So like I qualify now for this public or this social housing here as well. So we need to be really careful about what those numbers look like. We have affordable housing being developed, right? What we see actually across the globe is again, this is publicly owned. So instead of leveraging a private market and giving all of those incredible benefits over to private developers in exchange for this tiny little spectrum of public housing units, what they actually do is hold them completely out of the market, which allows them to control the permanent affordability forever, right? We get to hold on to all those wonderful benefits and ensure that those units remain affordable. The other really key thing that we see across the globe is that we mix those spectrums of incomes much more balanced, right? That it's not leveraging all the folks at the top end, but actually creating a beautiful spectrum and people all live together, right? No separate floors, no separate buildings. We actually just put everybody at all these different incomes levels together. And it's not based on a profit margin at that point because they're publicly owned, right? What it's determined on is how to ensure that sustainable financial continuation of that building, right? That there's enough income across all of the different income spectrums that it covers the cost for that building to continue to be maintained into perpetuity. It's a beautiful thing.
And I would just like to ask, in addition, could you give like a 30-second overview of maybe some other places in the world that do this already that people could do further research into, just like give an idea?
Yeah, I never do anything in 30 seconds, so I'll just say that right now. So what I will say is that it's all over the globe, right? So you'll see this in Central America, you'll see it in South America, you see it all over Europe, you see it in Asia. The gold standard that we usually point to is in Vienna, where more than half of all housing is actually government owned, government controlled, right? Including tenant control as well, right? So like leadership functions that are tenant controlled in those systems. But more than half of all units then are actually social housing. And if you knew this already, perhaps you did, or perhaps you didn't, Vienna is also considered one of the most livable cities in the entire world.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's very, very good. You wanna?
Yeah. Our next question is for Linda. How do we ensure that new housing projects such as social housing do not further contribute to gentrification and displacement, specifically in Seattle?
So in my thinking, social housing models really ought to follow like infrastructure, right? We build infrastructure for everybody because we know it's a general need, a basic right. And in the US, we have monetized housing in a way that eliminates, a significant portion. So it's this massive sort of rethinking about what our values are, what our basic human rights are, and I don't know how you do that other than dismantling the system and rethinking it. But I think that's really what it will take. Some of the historic models that we look at, or that we look at across the world, tend to be in nations that have very homogenous kind of populations, and where they think, well, everybody has a right, but everybody kind of looks alike too. It's more difficult to get to a point of marginalizing some. So I don't know how we twist our minds so that we get there, but I think that that's really important for us in order to rethink the current model that we use for housing. I mean, housing is a basic right, and so it's infrastructure, and so let's build it for everybody and let I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm not directly answering the question because it's hard for me to fit it in. We're just not structured for it right now. And I don't think there are little fixes for it. So I'm sorry for taking us in kind of a different direction, but I think we're going to have to do some big systemic sort of thinking in order to get to a different place. We simply can't do little fixes for the damage that we've already created.
Thank you for that. And I think you bring up a good point that these are not little issues and it's not going to be a simple fix. And so we appreciate being able to hear what you had to say. So thank you.
Yeah, and then so next we want to ask Kate about your activism and your advocacy. So I guess we want to know, what can communities and individuals do to support advocates of social change? What can we do as an audience right now to get involved?
That's such a great question. I think the most important thing is to just make your legislators hear you. Send emails, make phone calls. Coming to city council meetings has gotten a lot easier since the pandemic because you just have to call in and do it on Zoom. You don't even have to, they don't even see your face. You get just a minute or two to talk. I need to really make them hear you. And we can go into like what is like the best way to give testimony, but I think the most important thing for everyone in this room to understand is that you are important just as you are. Your lived experience and your story is powerful. And certainly, even if it wasn't, that's not stopping so many people from calling into council meetings. And then the other thing to do is you can organize in a smaller level too. Like I'm talking about citywide organizing, but you can organize in your building. If there's like maintenance problems, things like that, like you can work with your neighbors, you can develop relationships. It's important to build that because you have more power together and you also have a stronger sense of community. like Zach was saying with Yesler Terrace and them separating out the income levels by building. Like that is not building community. that is you know, segregation based on income essentially. But there are ways to like bridge those gaps, and that includes talking to your unhoused neighbors and seeing how you can help them and support them. You know, the city has been doing major sweeps, and like imagine if you were living in a tent and then someone was like, actually we're just gonna throw your tent away. No, we don't really have anywhere else for you to stay. Like your living situation goes from like bad to worse so quickly. And like I said, 46% of us were rent burdened. We are so close to that. And the like further we can get from that rent burdened, the more stability we'll have in our housing.
Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you, Kate. We are now going to have the last question for this portion for Carl. And the question is, what is most misunderstood about houselessness? What would you say to people who feel removed from issues around houselessness but want to help?
You know, the people think about homeless person. They usually think about the very visible homeless people in town, or the homeless people on the news, or you know. But there are lots of invisible homeless people, especially women and children. You don't see, you know, on the street, or, you know, they are homeless, but they try hard not to, you know, on the street. So they couch surfing, or, you know, and then, yeah. So people think it's, you know, homeless people is a violence. And also I was talking to my church member the other day, and I find out they have also that stereotype image from the media, and you know, he was thinking government offered all the like a 5-6 option of housing, but they don't want to take it. So, you know, but that's not true. If you ask the people get sweep, you know, do they ask you all the, you know, like housing options? And they say no. So it's not always the case. Maybe they did once, or I don't know, before in the past, but and then yeah, so it's everybody is, you know, in different reason they become homeless, and it's the best way to help them is, I think, just to start knowing the person, you know, and just then, you know, you can figure out the best way for that person, you know, what kind of help they need, and you know, what's the question? Oh yeah.
Yeah, so essentially, what I'm most surprised by, or I guess I'm not really surprised, but you mentioned how in the media that they mentioned people get provided with housing options, but from your personal experience, it seems like that's not always the case with people you've spoken to. So I guess to follow that up with, how do you feel like the media misrepresents people? Do you feel like there are ways that we can show that that's not accurate? Because I guess we all know that there's a lot of misrepresentation happening, but how do you feel is the best way to counter that?
That's very hard, kind. So for media to gosh, what's
Or sorry, I guess more specifically, for real change,
Yes.
what do they do to help dispel that myth, dispel those myths?
Mm. No, we are also the media, and and we are try to tell what's really going on through our paper and or our uh, to our vendor and stuff, but it's yeah. And then this pandemic to make it very worse for more people blame on homeless people because you know or or like lots of business closed because of pandemic, and they all blaming on homeless people, and um, I don't know what to do. um,
I mean, that's a fair response. I feel like it's such a complicated issue that really just we need to start with the discussion in the first place and recognizing that it's an issue. I think all of us don't necessarily expect an answer. I guess we're all needing to think about, what that means, and trying to work together. Because I know it's a difficult question to answer. Like there's no real way to immediately change how people view things. Like Linda was talking about earlier, there are some changes that I think come from within, and we need to work on educating people and really changing people's perspectives. So that's what we've been hoping to do tonight. Do you have anything lastly to add? We're going to transition into the live Q&A portion.
me?
Yeah, you, Carl, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mom. And that's the
Yeah.
Right. No, no, yeah. I have a lot of things I want to say, but I just
Yeah. Yeah, we might get some more live questions directed towards you. So don't feel like you need to don't feel like you need to summarize all of your thoughts right now, because we still have some questions coming in from the audience. So no pressure to do that immediately. Thank you for speaking.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are opening up the panel to questions from the audience. We have people on Zoom as well as in person. I think we're going to start with a couple questions from the audience live, but if people are typing in chat and Zoom, we can also read that as well. So feel free to type in the Zoom chat.
Gosh. Actually, I'm not sure I understand that question or not. But, sorry. I don't know actually. Yeah. Oh, just um, yeah, I see. But mm, um, so yeah. mm, Yeah. I'm sorry.
So for people who are on Zoom, the question is about the barriers to getting housing, like background checks, et cetera, uh, that exclude people. And so Zach, I guess the question is, how does that work with social housing? Is that still in place, those restrictions for people?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, the question itself is the exact kind of question that we need to be asking as we develop something like this. So really, when we think about the terms of like social housing and the development of something brand new, for the most part of what we're doing here, we have the ability to really talk about the things that we really need to include in this, right? So as we're at the state level having a lot more conversations now about like clearly the problems that like credit checks and like, you know, minimum deposits and money in the bank sort of causes for folks, I think there is an opening for us in here. Also, I would say that a lot of the plans that we were talking about, Camille talked about at the very beginning of this, is really about like our development of what that model is going to look like. We can call out all the stipulations and all the things that we want to create in this if we put it in that kind of way. But to the exact point as to the question you're asking, it's listening to people. It's recognizing that all of the things that all of the folks sitting at City Hall are going to try to think about when they say, let's do social housing. We have to actually listen to people's diverse experiences to understand where those barriers are. And then we can make the decision to take those barriers away. Those are our decisions, right? This is a public space. This is a policy, right? A public policy. We have all the rights to be organized in that kind of way and share our voices into that. That means that we have to be critically thinking and examining the kinds of things we want to develop and actually talking to people and listening to them so that we can ensure that the accessibility for something like this meets the standard and the goals that we want to accomplish.
All right, we have another question I'm going to take from Zoom, and that is, what do you think is the biggest barrier to passing social housing initiatives in the city? What do we need to overcome to help people understand this is needed? And I'll leave the floor open to anyone who feels like they want to answer that question.
Capitalism. I mean, that was pretty much it, actually. Yeah, the biggest barrier is that people think that you shouldn't get anything for free. But housing is a human right. At the end of the day, like, everyone deserves food, housing, clean air, clean water, like all of these very basic things. And we have billionaires in this city. We have enough money in this city that we shouldn't be struggling like this. Renters shouldn't be struggling the way that we are. We shouldn't have a homelessness crisis. But it's really hard to convince the people with that money to part with it. So we need to collectively build more power to overcome that, because their money gives them power inherently.
Can I just jump in as well? Sorry, I love that answer, by the way. You know, sometimes short and sweet is the best way to go. And as I said, I usually am not that. I think there's a couple of key things that we need to be thinking about in terms of what the barriers are. I think there's political ones, right? Socio-political ones. There's also financial ones, right? Because there's a lot of people that'll say, that sounds like a great idea, but we don't have any money. And that goes to something that Carl actually added that I think is one of the most brilliant things, right? We have the exact amount of money to go and build all kinds of marble step buildings and create these beautiful city halls. And we can create all kinds of, you know, wonderful public libraries, which I love and support, by the way, right? But if we're choosing that over the housing of people, this is a dramatically, disconnected issue, right? We have a distaste for public housing. So immediately talking about social housing, people are going to already have in their minds, oh, I remember that, all the poor people causing all kinds of problems, right? All the conflation of terms that goes on with that sort of thing. We love the belief that the market is going to distribute everything fairly. I can tell you one thing, a privatized housing market is not designed for equity, right? It is not designed for equity, it's designed for profit making. We still rely on all kinds of individual pathologies about what creates poverty, right? So we have to challenge and dismantle a lot of those ideas that actually it's not poor people that are causing these problems, but systemic problems around this. We blame the poor all the time. The primacy market is the ultimate issue that we're going to have to address in this. All of our federal programs are designed essentially to leverage the private markets, right? They are not designed to pull things out of the private market and keep them in public hands. For some reason, we have a distaste for something like that as well. Saying we have no money for public housing and we have no money for social housing, that is a policy choice that we have just stated, right? That's not a reality, that's a policy choice.
Maybe I say something short too. You know, in America, whatever the government run or something like a socialism or communism, they kind of demonize, you know, it's a bad thing. You know, if the government runs it, it's no good. And that stereotype thing also need to change, I think.
Thank you for that. We have another question in the chat, and the question is, are there legal barriers to the city of Seattle taking a current Vienna model where they buy land around the city and then lease or sell development rights / design competitions for development of publicly owned mixed income social housing?
I'll try to be quick because I don't want to dominate this conversation. No, there are not legal barriers to trying to create something like this. Again, there are distastes for these kinds of models, right? Because we love the idea that the private market is the best way to distribute goods. So there are lots of barriers, right? Legal is not one of them. We do have legal barriers to all kinds of things that are really bad, like you can't have rent control in the state at all because we've banned something like that. All kinds of legal barriers to other things. Social housing and doing what's going on in Vienna right now, that is a policy choice. We absolutely have the right to do it. It is not illegal in any kind of way. We have to have the will and the ability for us to push for something like that.
And we had a question from the audience. I'll repeat it. I think my question was, that sort of mentioned the failures of like mixed income housing or like housing where the goal is like integration, and how in reality just sort of replayed segregation. And so I think we any audience member, but had a lot of really great points, so maybe some of the other audience members as well. How can we think about like actualizing really integrated housing while also sort of prioritizing that there should be a different, like someone, just because someone makes more money, they don't deserve a safe home and a crappy small room with barely Yeah, so for those over Zoom, the question is about integration of mixed income. How do we make sure that that actually plays out in reality with social housing so that people have those like basic same standards of living and that people don't end up segregated by income?
I can speak to that just briefly. When Zach talked about Yesler, there was the separation of the buildings by income, and you know that those buildings probably have different property managers, different landlords. Eliminating that and just making social housing a place where people want to live would do that completely. Giving the tenants themselves power over what they want their community to look like and their building to look like. That means everyone in the voice has the same amount, everyone in the building has the same amount of power regardless of their income. So if security is an issue, that's something that is an issue for all of the residents. So the wealthier people in that building can voice their complaints just as the poor people, but there was not going to be a difference in what they receive. So if we put a higher standard of living on social housing to begin with, you should want to live there. I would want to live there. We all want to live there. So that's kind of the joy of social housing.
Thank you so much for this conversation, this discussion, sharing your expertise. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon to continue this ongoing conversation on housing and Seattle and finding solutions through social housing. And thank you again so much to the panelists, Zach, Carl, Linda, and Kate, for taking the time to help us all learn together. Thank you.
And just to close out, I want to thank our professor, Dr. Vicki Lawson, for making this connection possible, and Camille also from Real Change for kind of working together throughout the quarter to make this event actually work out and helping us get panelists. So I really appreciate that. Thank you again for coming out tonight. We are going to have our classmates hold back for just a minute, but everyone else, you are free to go. Thank you for coming tonight.
Also, a quick reminder that on the table on your way out, there are flyers that talk a little bit more about the campaign for social housing, as well as an opportunity to sign up if you're interested in getting involved with our campaign and coalition.